Welcome back. Welcome back. We're going to jump into chapter 10 today. Jump into that. So, without further ado, there it goes. Where is it? All right. So, chapter 10. So, in chapter 10, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about language, why we use language, how we use language, because in professional speaking, when we're speaking to others, we need to think about the language we're using and how it may affect the outcome. We're also going to talk about standards for language in public speaking, meaning what we should strive for, how we should use our language. And then we're going to talk about developing your ability to use language within public speaking. So when we think about language, what is language? Well, language is defined as any formal system of gestures, signs, sounds, and symbols used or conceived by as a means of communicating some sort of thought, meaning it could be through written, enacted, or even spoken means. So language, when you think about language, we can write language down, right? We can act out in charades. Now, most of the time, though, when we say the word language, we're typically thinking of spoken word, especially when it comes to public speaking. Written language and spoken language do differ in many ways. When we think about that, let's talk about how they differ. So, for instance, when we're talking about something and trying to describe it, we're probably going to reference things around us. Something that it was a golden color, like the color of the yellow on my bag, right? We could use a reference of something around us. And in public speaking, we do that often. We refer to our charts and our graphs and our PowerPoints, right? Whereas if it's written, we may have to refer to say see chart such and such, and it's much more formal. Now, I don't want you to think that public speaking is not formal. It is, but written language usually is the most formal form of language, form of communication. Spoken word is slightly less formal, slightly more informal, not informal. We're going to talk about that. So when we think about even the idea of studying language, it tends to be controversial because it tends to be hard to wrap up in analytics, wrap up in science. So one of the concepts of study of language is a concept called words don't have meaning. I want you to think on that. I just pause, right? Words don't have meaning. We, the receiver of a word, public speech, we form the meaning of how that speaker is using it, what it is that they're trying to say. Our brain processes that information and files it away. And we do this without thinking a lot. It's just something we do. It's part of us. It's ingrained in us. Our brain decodes a message. I talked earlier in the class about, the sender and the receiver concept, where my words go to you and then you receive them, but you have to actually interpret them. You have to find meaning within those words. Otherwise, they're just words. And when we study language, one of the biggest tricks or problems with studying language, I guess, is that it's extremely difficult to separate language from our thinking and our receiver's thinking. Is that fair? Think about it. When we speak, we have to think about our words. And when the receiver is listening, they have to think about our words. So it's powerful. It's a powerful thing. It's amazing, and it's a beautiful concept. It's super deep. We're not going to dive into it because this is public speaking basic level, right? But I've spent a great deal of time with 3 degrees in communication studying those ideas, those concepts. Language itself tends to be affected by people in power and by how much power we ascribe to the speaker. Meaning, are they an expert? Do we feel that they're powerful? Do we feel that we should listen? That's a choice we make. But language also affects power too. Meaning, when someone's powerful and they flub up enough speeches, we tend to think less highly of them, right? Politicians really run into this. Teachers run into this. Sometimes bosses at work run into this. There are people who have maybe a little bit more authority, right? Or supposed to. But yet, many of us have had a boss that when they speak, they prove they're less intelligent than we hoped. And by doing that, we tend to respect them less. So even the concepts and thoughts between when we think about language, um, we can say things without saying things. We can hide meanings or obscure a meaning. What we mean by that, that's called a euphemism. We can have a coded message or semi-hidden message within a message. So he who defines the terms wins the debate. All right. When we think about that kind of concept, what we're saying with that statement, what the euphemism is, those who make the rules tend to win. And I think many of us have felt that way at some point in our life where we didn't get to make the rules and we didn't feel like we were winning. Another thing in language that we do without really thinking about many times, denotative and connotative use of words. And we're going to look more at that coming up. So I'm not going to dive deep into that one just yet. Next slide, we'll kind of dive into that. But I want to talk about ethics. Ethical language use really will encourage people to respect us as a speaker and shows as the speaker, respect for others. It also allows for the audience to have freedom of thought, meaning they can be against us, right? They could be feeling like, I don't know that I want to be on your side of this equation, right? It's okay to have a debate. It's okay to communicate a different thought. Remember, I talked about that early on in the class. I don't like hate, but freedom of speech protects hate, even hate speech to a point, a small point. I don't have to like it, but I like the freedom of the ability to speak our minds, our thoughts. Because we can inform others and help them make important decisions. And that's the power of public speaking. I know a lot of people think, oh my goodness, when we have to do the persuasion, it's so scary. You have to change your mind. You don't have to change my mind. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to dive into the science of changing someone's mind, which is difficult, right? But what I want you to think about when you're speaking to others, be respectful to them. That way, and make sure it shows. Because if it shows, they will be more apt to be respectful to you, meaning listen. And we want to promote freedom of thought. We want to promote freedom of ideas. The best ideas, and this is an exercise I miss because the classroom, I miss teaching it in person, but one of the exercises I do is I literally grab my class and I'll pull them in and say, today we're going to pretend we work at an advertising agency. Many of you guys may have no thought or desire to be in that field, and that's okay. But I give you an idea, I give you a topic to think about and try to figure out what other words you can come up with. So I'm challenging you right now to kind of think about this. I want you as my audience, as my class, as my advertising agency in a frame of speaking, right? I want you to embrace this for a moment. And if I say the word barbecue, I want you to come up with about 10 words, 10 words for barbecue, or not necessarily meaning barbecue. And I'll give you an example: sweet, hot, savory, right? Words that express what barbecue could be. Meat, right? Then we can think about what types of meat: pork, beef, chicken, turkey, you name it. The point is, when we explore an idea and we use our language, our words, my words will influence your words. Because when I started speaking out my words, when I said sweet, you thought of something probably. And it's crazy. That's how language works. So let's dive into denotative and connotative. So if I say the word jaguar, what do you think of? Which one of these did you think of? Did you think about the British sports car? Or did you think about an animal, a big cat? Either way, you're right. I just said the word jaguar. I didn't specify what type of jaguar. Now, do you see the problem sometimes our words can cause? In English, we have many words that can mean slightly different things in different scenarios. It can be a little tricky. I'm not looking for you to be an expert speech maker at the end of this class. I would like you to have the real skills to be able to give a speech and feel comfortable about it. That's my end goal. But we have to be clear about the words we use. So when I use the word jaguar, I probably need to specify which one I'm talking about, right? Phrase, what's up, dog? Up, dog, right? Here's the dog from Up, also the dog from Toy Story. What am I talking about when I say that phrase? It's a lost phrase, thank goodness. I never liked it. It's so antiquated now in language. And that's the beauty of language. We move through language. If I say the word huzzah, does that mean anything to you? For most people, it doesn't. Huzzah was like hooray, or yes, when they're celebrating a victory in sports, right? Huzzah was that word in the 1700s, early 1800s. Huzzah, hooray. Language changes over time. So when you're thinking about your language and how we should use language effectively within your speech, think about the difficulty or the degree to which language is appropriate. We want to make sure we keep our language appropriate, right? For our audience, meaning, is it too big of a word, too small of a word? Is it familiar to them? Is it vivid, descriptive, right? And ultimately, is it inclusive? Does it bring them in as an audience? I want to pull you in to me, right? I want to grab you and pull you in, not in an aggressive way, but as a speaker. Hey, I'm giving you some ideas. I want you to think about it. So when we think about using the appropriate language, be careful. I told you there's power in positivity. There's also power in negativity, but we're going to talk about that a little later. Most audiences want to hear speech about positivity, right? We don't typically go into an audience and say, oh man, I can't wait to hear how the speaker's going to trash our school. What? No, nobody wants to go into that audience, right? That's not something we want to hear. So think about your language when you give a speech. Let's be positive, not negative. Pro-choice or pro-life. Positive. Two different sides of a coin, right? Yet you saw what I just said. I said pro or pro because here's the thing. Let's be positive. Think about the words you're using. Look at your language. Look at the words you're thinking about using and think about it. Is my audience going to understand what these words are? Is it suitable? Does it befit ourselves, meaning us, the speaker? And does it befit, meaning does it work for that audience? Think about our context. What is it we're trying to say? And then just think about the words within the speech itself. Think about our main ideas and work from there. The words come pretty easy, but remember, it's up to us to keep the message positive. One of the first questions you can ask yourself is whether the language that you plan on using really works for you. I don't want you to speak like me. I'm your public speaking teacher. I don't want you to speak like me necessarily. I want you to choose appropriate words for your audience and yourself. Now, ultimately, your audience is me, but I want you to take a broader approach when you're giving your speeches. I don't want you to make your speech directed to me. I want you to make your speech just like it would be normally. I want it to be like you were giving it to the class. So think about our language. I'm not going to talk about too many broad terms about science or communication with you until I define those terms. So think about it. If there are words people don't understand, we may need to define them. We may have to tell you which type of jaguar I'm talking about. You don't have to sound super sophisticated. Please don't use $1,000,000 words if you don't think you can handle the $1,000,000 words. And if you don't think your audience can handle the $1,000,000 word, meaning words with, you know, 20 letters or more, right? If you don't think your audience can handle it, then maybe we need to step back, redefine what that word really means. And if it means we have to use 4 words instead of that 1 word, but it conveys the message better to our audience, then that's what we should do. Keep jargon, medical terms, whatever it might be, science terms, whatever your field is, whatever you're talking about, keep those terms to a minimum and define them as you start to use them the first time. One of the second aspects of appropriateness, goes back to that idea that I mentioned. Is my audience going to understand? If you were an engineering student, you could give a speech to your engineering class. You'll be able to use those words that engineering students would know. If you're a medical student, you'd be able to use medical terminology that you wouldn't have to explain to a normal person. They would already know that. But if you use your engineering speak in this class or your medical speak in this class, and you don't define the terms, many audience members may not understand, and ultimately you lose them in the speech. And honestly, it's like the worst thing you could do. When you think about what it is you're trying to achieve, you're trying to inform someone, entertain someone, enlighten someone, or even change their mind about something. And if you're losing a third of your audience, you're ruining your effectiveness, right? So be careful. Use words that work for you and work for your audience. If you were speaking about the Great Depression and it was to a group your age, you probably can't assume that they would know what a New Deal is, or the WPA, or the CCA. They wouldn't know because because you guys didn't grow up in that. I didn't even grow up in that era. That's my grandparents' era. My grandparents are all gone, by the way, too. So, I mean, that tells you, it's it's a lost world, but it's an interesting time, and it's interesting, especially right now, because you can see how things have evolved. Things like Social Security have evolved, or public programs like public medicine have evolved from these ideas. Things that grew up, that happened during this time, where the government was feeding the people literally. My family farm was supporting that area of the Midwest with feeding people who were unemployed. The government was buying our crops and helping us, obviously, continue to move that farm forward, continue to stay farming. So it was big, it was huge. You have to cover certain things in your speech that people aren't just going to understand. If I said the word inoculation, we would think that most people would know what an inoculation is. However, maybe it's a good idea to express what it is. So again, think about our language, think about our words. Then question the appropriateness. Is the language you're using suitable for what the subject really is? You could be addressing your fellow students in an auditorium, right? And that language would be different than you would use at a business meeting or in a hotel ballroom, or even when you were giving a special occasion speech as a best man or the bridesmaid, right? The maid of honor. That's the word I was looking for. See, I even had to struggle through my brain to find the appropriate title. If you're giving a speech at an outdoor rally, you're not going to be using the same language probably that you use in a classroom. Now, I will probably come closest to that, but that's just because I've done this for so many years. Remember, you're speaking to an audience. You're going to think about what's going on, what time of day it is, the mood of the audience. Are they hungry? Are they tired? Are they frustrated? Are they interested in the topic, or do you think they would be disinterested? Ultimately, if you think your speech topic is going to be disinteresting, that might be a topic you might want to steer around. You might want to move off of that one a bit. But I want you to pick topics that you're passionate about or mean something to you. When we think about how we use language in appropriateness, we have to think about the topic itself, what it is we're speaking about. So, if you're speaking about the early years of the Walt Disney Company, when Walt and his brother were running the show, we're going to we're going to use some of the language that they talk about within that. We're going to talk about it as the people. They were the miracle workers. They were the idealists. They were the embodiment of Disney, right? We're going to think about the graphics people and how they affected the world that would come later. How cartoons have been altered by Walt Disney. Another example is, if you think about a string theory, and it's mentioned in the book, and I'm not diving deeply into it, you want to wind your ideas around the string of your centralized thought, meaning winding it around the very topic of what you're saying. And then you also have to think about changing your tone, inflection, so that you're not monotone all the time, because this is not a very fun speech to hear, right? We've been there. I know most of us have. Think about using vivid language. You've got to have vivid language because people are creating a mental image of what it is that you're talking about, meaning it's up to you to create that picture. The more adjectives you use, the colors, the description. I grew up in the Midwest where the land is flat. And when I tell you it's flat, I could see from the family farm, which the farmhouse sits on a little hill. And when I say a little hill, it was about 50 foot over the rest of the farm. That hill was deposited there by the Ice Age. Literally, that hill did not exist. It was literally that flat because at one time it was a seabed during the dinosaur age. Now you're starting to get pictures of how flat the land is. That flatness is broken up by series of forests, but mainly those forests exist as boundaries or areas to wetlands that could not be farmed. Now you have another picture. Now you can start to think about the animals that might be there. It's not uncommon to have a 250-pound deer where I'm from. They're big. People think about elks. Elks used to live there, and honestly, elk is being reintroduced in the Midwest. But I mentioned something, wetlands. When we think about wetlands, what does a wetland mean to you? It's an area of a river bottoms, right? A low area where water collects. Some people go, ew, stinky, right? Because it can be. And when I think about wetlands, of course, I think about waterfowl, birds, ducks, geese, herons, birds like that. Seagulls. You're like, wait, seagulls? Yes, seagulls. Seagulls came up the Mississippi River. They were blown up the Mississippi River and they populated. Since they don't really have many natural predators in that area, we have sometimes 2,000, 3,000 seagulls in around a body of water. So it can be a little weird. The dog behind you, I don't know if you can still see her, Lucy. She's crashed out over there. She kind of blends in with the bed. Um, she's deathly afraid of seagulls. Somehow she thinks that they're going to scoop her up with their little web feet and take her away. So it's quite entertaining. She barks at them and they squawk at her, and it makes for actually a kind of annoying experience. Now, you just saw what I just did here. I told you a whole story. I wound you around the idea of how flat it is in the Midwest, what the farm might look like, the small hill, trees, big forest, talking oaks, pines, talking a lot of hardwood, birches, especially as you move to the wetlands, birches come in. Think about that. I wound you through a story to get you to my dog, to tell you a story about birds you don't expect to see in the Midwest and a dog. All that, I did that through using some more vivid language, describing things. Right? So, imagery is the use of language to represent ideas, objects, actions, deeds. Let's talk about imagery. Let's think about this. If I said the word disabled or handicapped, which we don't like to use these words, I don't feel that they're disabled. I don't feel like these people just may not have an easy opportunity to move through a situation as we would. And then again, I have a friend who makes very good money. He worked for the military. He lost both his legs. And he now works in the Midwest, and he's a crawl space specialist because he can move through a crawl space faster than just about anybody else I've ever seen. He took a situation which could be deemed a disadvantage and turned it into a positive. When we see that wheelchair symbol with a person sitting in it, we know that, hey, we're not supposed to park in it unless we're disabled, unless we have a sticker, unless we are allowed to park in that space. Imagery exists in a way. Symbols exist to create sort of a ease of communication, if you will, right? They're pictures that convey words. The stop sign, if I show you an octagon that's in red, you'll know. You don't need me to write the word stop on it to understand what that sign is. Right? Railroad crossing. Can you picture the sign? The more of these, the more adjectives, the more things I bring up to where your brain gets interactive, the better you'll remember what it is I said as a speaker. Because if we engage senses, and the more of them we engage, the better as a speaker we will be. We think about our 5 basic senses. We've got hearing, taste, touch, smell, and sight. If I bring any of those in, you're more engaged. Now, you can use concrete images, meaning like I literally help create a virtual picture of my family farm for you, right? How there was a hill, small hill, 50 feet, but it's towers over the flat landscape, right? How the forest, the trees are super tall. Field after field after field. if I look from the farmhouse and if I look to the north and west slightly, mainly north, I will see Strategic Airlift Command, called SAC. And for those who don't know what that is basically where everything that is military based, as far as Air Force certainly, but most other military branches get supplies to troops through that base, through that idea. It's logistics for the military. There's also strategic. I said SAC, so that's, and then there's also tactical command that's there, which means that's where the Air Force kind of moves a lot of its planes in and out, through, around, and keeps track of where everything is in a global environment, right? Now, I don't have to use concrete words. I can try using similes and metaphors. Like, remember simile? We have like or as in that. So her hair was as golden as the yellow on my bang. Once again, I'm showing you, right? Simile, like or as. I could say she has golden hair, concrete. I could use her hair was golden, metaphor. When we do those things, we engage our brain, we engage the audience's brain, and it helps our audience stick with us. When you're giving a speech on freedom, think about this. We could stand up and easily talk about works like Steiner and others who had amazing ideas on levels of freedom of thought and freedom of action, and how an audience, how a people, how a nation go through that process. But if you do that, you're probably going to put your audience to sleep. What's a better speech on freedom would be to take some of those ideas from Steiner and show some examples of people from history that others could reference, or current people that our audience could reference, and have them form a better understanding about freedom. We could talk about how Afghani women under Taliban rule have been denied their education, they have no real freedoms, they're subject to public floggings and possibly even executed, all because they didn't do what men said. That's a much more interesting topic to talk about on freedom than to go through what a bunch of textbooks talk about freedom, right? So when we think about that, we can grab those things. When we think about ideas, we want to create maybe a concrete or maybe an abstract version of it to where our audience can think more. But if they're going to think more, we have to fill in some of the gaps to help them think. Ultimately, in overview, when we talk about communication, when we talk about the power of communication, and I'm not concluding yet, okay, before someone thinks I'm in conclusion, I'm not there yet. Long lesson today, guys. When we think about standards of communicating, so we want to be clear, we want to be effective, we want to show our credibility or where we got the research from to make us appear more credible, right? We're going to use rhetorical techniques. So we're going to talk a little bit about rhetorical techniques. We've talked about appropriateness, meaning having a topic that our audience can identify with. So let's jump back. Rhetorical techniques again, simile, metaphor. Repetition is another rhetorical technique we can use. When we talk to an audience, we want to repeat things because that's how people remember. You, as my audience, I typically have to tell 3 to 5 times before it is you'll remember it and it will stay within your brain. 3 to 5 times. That's average. Some catch it on the first try. That's telegraphic or photographic memory, basically, depending on what concept you're utilizing. But the reality is, most people need repetition in order to get an idea across in their brain. So when we're thinking about our audience, we need to repeat our ideas. And because speeches are communicated orally, audience members need to hear the core message repeated more than once. Repetition used as a linguistic device will help the audience become more familiar with a speech, and they'll hear the ideas again and again, and pretty soon it sticks within their brain. It's pretty powerful. By repeating a phrase during the speech, you create some sort of rhythm. Potentially you could. Right? And when I think about speeches and rhythm and memorable use of repetition, I think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial, 63. I wasn't even alive. You guys weren't alive, right? But we know bits and pieces of that speech, right? I challenge you to watch that speech. It's powerful. The idea of that rally was about jobs and freedom. And in that speech, Martin Luther King Jr. repeated, I have a dream 8 times to create great dramatic effect. So let's dive through again. Clarity, again, we talked about abstract or concrete. If it's too abstract, everyone has a different meaning, or we don't have an understanding of it at all if it's really abstract. If it's too concrete, it may be too rigid and we may disagree about, or may not even understand the reference that way. With clarity, make sure you're using the right word. Lightning versus lightning bug. And that sounds silly, but it's important. If I'm giving you a speech on atmospheric effects, you're going to hear about lightning, right? If I'm giving a speech on insects, you're going to hear lightning bug. Make sure you reference this. Think about clarity and how it can play in a speech. My stepdaughter went to school in the Midwest for a brief moment. And in that, she learned about a definition of something she knew her whole life. And people in the Midwest had no idea what she was talking about. She said when we went to the grocery store, I'm going to go get the buggy. Now, I grew up on a farm. If I went to go get the buggy, by the way, there's still one there. There's no horses to pull it anymore. But if I went to go get the buggy, that meant a carriage of sorts, right? Old time transportation. Now, you all know what a buggy is here in the South. I know what a buggy is. But you should have seen Midwesterners look at her as they were attempting to figure out what in the world she was going to do. She's going to get the buggy, the shopping cart. They figured it out, but it just shows how regionally language can change and what we're familiar with. And of course, remember I told you with clarity, you can use literal or figurative types, meaning metaphors and similes, but avoid cliches if you can. Cliches are just that. They're not really positive. So when we look at things, and our book has this ladder of abstraction, when we think about the ideas, and we're going to take a concept. We're going to take the idea of wealth. What wealth means. Wealth is a symbol that refers to good fortune, prosperity, success in relationship to material goods and or life conditions, and usually health even involved in that. Right? You can afford to feed yourself well, afford to go to the doctor, afford these things. When I say the word wealth, you think, if I said wealth in a watch, maybe you think about Rolex, right? You think about top tier of any category. If I said I'm wealthy, I want you to think about what would you deem as a wealthy person's car, automobile. Think about it. Right? We'll all have different answers. Maybe for some it's a Mercedes-Benz. Maybe for others it's Bentley. You know. I mean, it just depends. For some, it would just be a brand new pickup truck. It's okay too. When we think about the concept of wealth, it is the most abstract because we all have slightly different ideas of that idea. What makes someone wealthy? If we think about the word asset, though, that asset is a symbol or a word that recognizes monetary worth of a possession, meaning it's worth something. Now, I mentioned an asset. At one point, that buggy on my family farm, notice the word buggy, brought it back. That buggy carriage was worth something because it was the main form of transportation off the farm to the city. Horses were worth something. The livestock on that farm was definitely assets, right? Which leads us to our next word. Livestock is a symbol. They're animals kept on a farm, right? Notice it's less abstract, it's more concrete. Now, if I say the word cow, you know exactly what I mean. Holy crap. It's a cow, right? It's a cow, an animal that's a bovine, milk bearing, right? And if I say the word Bessie, Bessie is the name of the cow on the farm. And so what I've done is I've walked you through this idea of wealth, asset, livestock, cow, Bessie, to get you to a point where you understand an idea. I've led you through Bessie's what part is part of what made our family farm work. And at times people considered us wealthy. I don't know. We were never wealthy. I can honestly tell you that. But maybe in an era we were, especially at a time where great unemployment was rampant. So when you think about these things, be concrete enough, but leave a little room. Make it fun for your audience. Language, again, should be a means of inclusion and connection, not exclusion. I told you, I don't ever think that my family was never wealthy. We own land, we own tractors. There's a big investment there, folks. But we don't spend a lot. Even my current situation, we don't spend a great deal. My wife and I, we tend to hold on to what we have. We tend to hold on to automobiles for a while. Recently we had to get another car because our one car died at 186,000 miles. The motor went. Thanks, Kia, by the way. I own Hondas that last over 300,000 miles. We now own a new Honda, by the way. We went back to Honda. We hold on to things. So to us, the idea of wealth is kind of different than what maybe others people would deem wealth, right? Again, abstract versus concrete. But a car is an asset, and car could be considered something of wealth. For example, if I'm a college student, a brand new Honda Accord Sport could be an extravagance, right? That would be considered an item of wealth necessarily because I don't have that kind of money to buy it, right? At that age, many times. So you see, it's all about concept. It's all about where an audience is in life. And we have to be careful that we don't alienate our audience. When someone has a disability or has a challenge in life, we need to be courteous of that. We need to think about inclusive language. We need to stay away from jargon, SEO, click through. These are items that are real world in my line of work. Besides teaching, I am a communication consultant, marketing consultant. I handle a lot of websites, tell people how they can restructure things, show them how they can use social media to be a driver in their business, things like that. And if I want to get my point across, I have to explain that to my audience, right? I don't want to use slang words unless I'm with the in group, meaning the people who would know. Try to avoid my complicated vocabulary. If you notice, I rarely use words that my audience can or my audience would struggle with. I try to use words that my audience can embrace and run with. I do that on purpose because I believe communication is inclusive. I believe communication shouldn't be someone holding something over another person's head. I believe that if we communicate in that manner, we could solve a great many social ills and problems in this country. Why we don't choose to do so, when we think about also being using proper language in speech, please don't curse or use profanity. It's not a comedy club or Friday night, comedy hour. We're not on HBO. Please don't. I'm going to go through a few more rhetorical techniques. They're listed in the book. Please, you could look at them. Assonance, pie in the sky, by and by, when you die, you see a similar sound repeated. Alliteration, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew. Again, alliteration, slightly different way to present the concept of rhyme within a word. Antithesis, integrity without knowledge is weak and useless, and knowledge without integrity is dangerous and dreadful. Meaning, I show a relationship between ideas. Parallelism, I came, I saw, I conquered. Anaphora, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Age of wisdom, the age of foolishness. It was epic of belief, it was the epic of incredulity. When we think about anaphora, when we use that concept, it shows how broad of a spectrum people have. Hyperbole. Let's look at hyperbole. When we think about hyperbole, typically we're using hyperbole for exaggeration, for effect. I kind of gave you the idea of the 50-foot hill and how it towers over the landscape in my family farm, right? Truth is, there is one other hill on the farm. And for those of you who know, uh, typically you bury people on a high point because you don't want to bury them on a low point because, it can wash up the caskets and be kind of gross, right? So the other hill on our family farm is the old family cemetery. Exaggeration for effect. Did you just see I even used hyperbole there? Um, could wash up the grave, right? Irony. The roasted chicken was as tender as a leather boot, right? Many people think about sarcasm. It's kind of another way we can bring things out. But be careful with sarcasm because sarcasm can trick your audience, and your audience may think you actually said something different. Again, remember appropriateness, gender inclusive language. Avoid our generic pronouns. I'm trying really hard to get past this. You got to understand my generation. I'm closing in on 50. I may not look it, but I'm closing in on 50. I've been around a long time, but I believe in avoiding these because I want people to have the ability to be who they believe to be. I don't know how else to say it. We all want to be somebody. Why shouldn't we be treated with the pronoun of choice? Okay, that's just pure and simple. I don't say the word mankind, humankind. I try to not use the phrase guys. I used to use that a lot early in my teaching career. I'm working my way through that. I use the word students because it doesn't mention any gender at all, right? It's students. You are students. Hopefully, you identify as a student. Please identify as a student in my class. I want to see you succeed. I don't want you to fail. If you fail to identify as a student in my class, you're doomed to fail, meaning you didn't do your homework, you didn't do the speeches, and unfortunately, there's nothing I can do to help in that moment, right? When we think about ethnic identities, it's such a slippery slope. We use them when we must. I try not to use them because we're people, we're equal, we're all individual. It doesn't, I don't see a benefit. I saw Morgan Freeman years ago do a speech on basically how do we avoid racism, and that was one of his things. We're people. I'm not an African American. I'm not a black, is what he said. We're people, And if we would start treating each other as equals, as people, it would be most proper, and we could avoid much of the racism that we predicate through exclusive language. Make sure you use correct terms. It's Asian, not Oriental. So when you're talking about a region, it's European, Asian, Eurasian, Australian. Okay. So make sure you're using the right place. Think about appropriateness. Look again, we talked about disability. We talked about disability, right? And not marginalizing people. Don't totalize someone. I told you about my friend. He is by far the best at going through a crawl space. I've never seen anyone go through a crawl space as quickly as he can and get the job done. I mean, it's amazing. Please, everyone has a purpose in this world. Everyone has a life. Everyone deserves that life. And when I think about appropriateness, I bring you back to why would we give the speech to VFW about Snapchat? Because age-wise, they're not going to be on the program typically. They could care less. If I were going up before the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, I might want to talk about what the VA, the Veterans Affairs hospitals, what changes they might be experiencing. That might be a more positive topic for my audience, right? Pick your topic well. Know your audience. You know, another way we can talk about language and think about it, we want to use definite definitions at the beginning of a speech. So if I'm talking about Jaguar, I'm going to tell you whether or not it's the car, the automobile company, or Big Cat. Use personal pronouns where applicable. Be proper with it. And build on your vocabulary as a speaker, as a person, as a student, but don't inflict your vocabulary upon others in an effort to seem superior. Remember inclusivity, right? We're all people. We all deserve to be heard. I want you to watch this video. I'm going to have it listed. This is going to be part of your exercise for chapter 10. Please watch this video about how to use repetition and why it is so important in public speaking. I want you to hear from somebody else about this topic. I want you to hear from somebody else who's an expert in the field. Talk about why we need to repeat. If you notice, many of the things I talked about today, I repeated more than once. That was on purpose. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the lesson. Thank you for getting through chapter 10, which is one of our more lengthy units. Very good. I will see you all soon.